It's time to get started with Gutenberg. At this point, you should be comfortable with Node, React, and Webpack. We'll be using these technologies to help us with Gutenberg development. If you're not comfortable with these concepts, then I recommend you check out the previous section. Right now, I'm looking at the Gutenberg editor. Everything here is extendable. There are two main areas you'll usually want to extend. The first area is the content itself. The content is made up of something WordPress calls blocks. It may not look like it, but every section here is a block. Each block comes with its own settings. I can even freely move them around if I wish. WordPress provides a way to create your own blocks. We'll take a look at how to do that in this section. The other area you can extend is the sidebar. The sidebar contains information such as the category, tags, status, etc. We'll be looking at how to extend this as well. Every area is extendable, but these are the two main areas you'll find yourself wanting to extend often. Here is what we're going to do. Earlier, we created a recipe custom post type. We're going to create a block that allows users to input information about a recipe. This will include information such as ingredients, cooking time, utensils, cooking experience, and a meal type. The overall process for creating a block will look like the following. First, you have to prepare your environment. This step is optional, but this is how I prefer to do things, and so I will teach you how to prepare your environment. This is basically setting up Webpack, React, and Babel. Next, you have to load in those files. Gutenberg comes with a few hooks for making sure your CSS files are loaded. Then, you have to register your block. Once again, WordPress makes this process easy. All you have to do is call a few functions and you're set. Once you've taken care of that, you will need to create the settings for your block. This includes stuff like the title, icon, and form fields. Lastly, you will need to tell Gutenberg how it should display your block. Now that we have an overview of things, let's start with the first step. That would be preparing the environment. Inside the Recipe plugin directory, create a folder called Blocks. We will be placing all our code related to blocks and the Gutenberg editor here. You don't have to name your files or folders anything special. You can name this whatever you want. I also want to highlight that we're not placing this folder inside the Includes or Assets folder. This directory will contain a mixture of JavaScript, CSS, and PHP code. Gutenberg is mostly written with JavaScript. This is why we're not placing it inside the Includes directory, as the code will be vastly different. However, a lot of the logic inside these files do affect how WordPress functions rather than the user experience. That is also why we're not placing this inside the Assets folder. This is how I prefer to structure my plugin. If you prefer to do something else, then that's completely fine. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a zip file that contains some starter files. Download it and unzip the contents into the blocks folder we just created. This is basically the same setup we had in the previous section with some additional features. Let's go through this one by one. Open the package file. We're going to start with the dependencies. The first module is the Babel core module, which will allow us to write the latest features of JavaScript. Right after this, we're loading the Babel plugins Transform React JSX module. That's quite a long name, which can make it seem intimidating, but it performs one simple task. It allows you to rename a function. The function it'll change is the React.createElement function. Previously, you learned that this function will create an HTML element. As you can imagine, it's a pretty common function to use no matter what you're building. The problem with this is that React can change how this function works in the future. WordPress prides itself in being backwards compatible. If this function changes, then all plugins will have to update as well. While the most popular plugins will keep up, the lesser used plugins will quickly become outdated. To resolve this, WordPress wraps the React.createElement function with its own function. Even if the React version changes, WordPress will make the adjustments required internally for you. Since that's the case, we want to be able to tell Babel to use the WordPress version of this function. This is what that plugin does. You'll see how that's configured in just a moment. Then we have the Babel Loader module for Webpack. Right after this is the @WordPress/Babel preset default module. This is a new module I'm introducing. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this module. As we discussed before, Babel can be used with various presets. These presets determine what features of JavaScript you can write. It helps Babel convert your code into code that most browsers can understand. Previously, we used the Babel preset env module. However, we're going to need some additional features that aren't available under this module. This will force us to install additional modules and go over them. Luckily, the WordPress development team created their own preset that has us covered. Now we don't have to configure Babel as much. Let's keep moving forward. Afterwards, we're loading in a module called Cross Environment. As you may know, there are various operating systems with their own set of commands. Windows is particularly known to be quite troublesome in this area. The Cross Environment module will make sure that certain settings and commands will work across all operating systems. It's a great module for keeping things consistent. Lastly, we're loading in the Webpack and Webpack CLI modules, which we went over in the previous section. These dependencies will start us off. There's quite a few more modules I want to introduce, but we'll look at those as the course progresses. Something I want to highlight is that you don't have to be an expert on these modules. All of these modules are configurable, but a lot of the defaults work just fine. If we were building a server, then we might want to configure this further, but we're just building blocks. All that's important is that you have an overview of things. Alright, let's keep moving forward. If you look inside the scripts property, you'll find that the commands are slightly different. First up is the cross-env command. This will assure that the commands we execute are cross-compatible with multiple operating systems. This is related to the cross-environment module we talked about earlier. It's important that the cross-env command is entered first so that all the other commands and options that follow after it will work. Next, we're setting the Babel environment variable to default. This will just make sure the default settings are used in Babel. Afterwards, we're calling the Webpack command and setting the watch option. In the previous section, we had to continuously run the commands anytime we updated a file. The watch option will force Webpack to continuously watch for changes. This should save us some time. That should do it for this file. Let's move on to the webpack.config.js file. At the very top, we're loading the path and Webpack modules. Then, we immediately export an object that contains our settings for Webpack. A lot of this is the same as before from the entry to the output properties. There are three things different here. First is the watch property. This will force Webpack to continuously watch the file for changes. We're already doing this in our command, so this is a bit redundant. I just wanted to show you the two ways of going about this. It's all preference. Next, we have the DevTool property. Webpack will take the time to generate source maps for our JavaScript files. The purpose of a source map is to convert compressed and minified code back into its original state. There's very little impact on performance, but build times do increase. There are various values you can use, but I prefer to use the cheap eval source map. This results in a very fast build time, but the source map isn't that great. That's perfectly fine since we won't be using a source map. We want something fast and cheap. The last change is in the rules for the Babel loader. I'm adding a new property called exclude. This will make sure Babel doesn't run any files in a particular directory. In this case, we don't want Babel to process any files inside the node_modules directory. We didn't do this before because the previous examples were simple. However, things are going to get a little more complicated from here on out, and so I want to make sure this directory doesn't get affected. That'll do it for this file. The last file I want to go over is the .babelrc file. Not much going on here. I'm just using the WordPress default preset we installed earlier. We don't have to worry about adding the React preset as the WordPress default preset already covers that for us. The second property we're using here is called plugins. Plugins work exactly as you think. They allow third-party modules to extend Babel directly. All we're doing here is telling Babel to use the Transform React JSX plugin. We're also configuring the plugin by passing in an additional object. We're setting the pragma property to wp.elements.createElement. That is WordPress's version of the react.createElement function. We're essentially telling Babel to use the WP version when transforming elements to JavaScript. That's basically it. Once again, you don't have to be an expert on every module, but it's good to have a general overview of things. The great thing about this is that it's reusable. You can copy this from project to project and things will just work. Now that we have things set up, let's install and check if everything works. Inside your command line, you may need to cd into this directory to run the installation. I'm going to input cd wp-content/plugins/recipe/blocks. Then, I'm going to run the commands npm install to install the modules inside the dependencies object. This may take a while for some of you, so be patient. Lastly, let's run the commands npm run dev. This should have Webpack process the code. You shouldn't be able to run any additional commands since Webpack is continuously watching our files for any changes. Inside the blocks directory, there should be a new directory created called dist. This will contain the bundle.js file. That should confirm everything is working as expected. That does it for this lecture. We've prepared our environment. The next step is to begin enqueuing and registering everything. We'll do that in the next lecture. I'll see you there.